So in this presentation, we're going to take a look at a different kind of material called a physic material. And in order to demonstrate this, I'm going to select my platform or my ramp object. And I'm going to add a physic material in its box collider. So this is just a standard cube object that's been scaled and rotated just a little bit. I did add a standard material to it. But in addition, we're going to create and add a physic material, and physic materials go inside the collider of the target object. So in previous presentations, I've made a materials folder. So I'm just going to borrow that material folder. In some cases, it might make sense to make a subfolder or a separate folder, depending on how complex the project is that you're working on. But in this case, I'm just going to let the physic material run free in the root of the material folder. And in order to create a physic material, all we have to do is right click or control click and choose to create. And in this list, we should find a physic material. Now we want to avoid the physic material 2D. If it does not say 2D on it, it's usually a 3D material or physics interaction. And there's those two different physics engines inside Unity. We'll talk about the difference between the two much later in this class. This leaves us with a physic material. And I'm going to call this bouncy. Okay, or just bounce maybe. Or maybe the kind of material that I'm trying to emulate, like rubber. Let me just call this bounce for now. With that material selected, if we go to the inspector, you can see that we have different options here. And the one that I'm going to focus on, I'm going to not be so concerned with the friction right now, but the bounciness. And the bounciness is going to operate at a scale of 1 to 0. And if I just slide, if I click and hold on the label, you can see that I can increase that value to 1. If I key in a value over 1, it snaps back down to 1. And if we roll our mouse over and let it float, we should get a tooltip that tells us that we can operate in a value between 0 and 1, anywhere in between. So if we want to do 0.1, or in this case, I'll just increase it all the way up to 1. So I now have a bounce material that I can apply to any object with a collider. So I'll go to my platform, and I want to target this field that says inside the box collider that says material, none, physic material. And what I can do is just click and drag, so left click and drag, all one motion, and drop that material in this space. Now, because the inspector is contextually sensitive, if I left click one time, because I've selected that material, it brings up the properties for that material. I don't want to do that. I want to make sure that I have my object selected, and I left click and drag and drop this into the field. Alternatively, what we can do is usually when we have a field that we can load information into in Unity, there's usually a little bullet over here on the right side. And if I click on that bullet, it'll bring up a list of all of the things in my asset folder that are appropriate to apply to this field. In this case, I have bounce. It finds bounce and says, okay, that's a legitimate entry for this field, or I can choose none. Okay, so if I want to remove the material that I've assigned, I can do that, or I'll assign bounce, and I'll just double click to make sure that it's applied. So I now have this material, this physic material, added to the collider of my platform with a bounce value of 1. So I'll hit the play button and see what happens. And so now you can see I get a different result. I get my sphere is bouncing off the surface, making a little bounce. Now, these materials can compound. So in this case, we added it to the platform, but let me just temporarily remove it. So I'll click on this little bullet here. I'll go to none and double click. And now I've removed that material. I hit the play button and see that it no longer bounces. I'll select my ball, and I'll drag my bounce material and add it to the sphere. So now anything that the sphere collides with, the actual material is applied to the sphere itself. So it's actually bouncing on just about any surface. I'll toggle the play button. I'm going to leave the bounce on my sphere. I'm going to go back to the platform, and I'll add bounce to the platform as well. And what we should see is that those two materials compound, and I get a more dramatic result between the two. Okay, so you can see that the bounce was much, much larger than it was with just the material applied to one of the objects. Now, This might be the case if I want to control the bounce between the two objects. I might want to have two different materials, because this bounce, if I were to modify this and say 0.2, anything that uses or references that bounce material is going to now adopt the value of a bounciness of 0.2. So I might want to have a material, and I'll just rename this by left clicking on the title after I have it selected. I'll call this bounce ball, and I'll increase this to 1. And I'll either make a new physic material by right clicking, choosing to create, and going to physic material. And I can call this bounce platform. Okay. And then I'll modify the bounciness here of, say, 0.4 just to get started. I'll select my platform and either click, drag, and drop that material in here, or I'll just click on the ellipse, and now you can see that I have two different materials to choose from in this field, and I'll choose bouncy platform. And so what this will allow me to do is that the sphere has one bounce value, which will be consistent with whatever it bounces into, and now the platform I can control independently by going to bounce platform, and maybe if I want less bounce in that, I'll take that back to 0.1 and hit play. There we go. So I still have the sphere bouncing off the ground, but I can ramp up the bounciness of this surface if I want to. So just something to kind of play with, just to experiment. I'm going to select this platform, Command D or Control D to duplicate. Now I have platform 1, and I'm going to move this over, but this time around, rather than moving it according to one axis, so either X or Y, what I'm going to do is I'm going to restrict the axis and move it according to two axes at a time. So what I'm looking for is I'm looking for the blue rectangle with the move tool. And what the blue rectangle will do is allow me to move this object in any direction other than in the direction of the blue axis. So in other words, if I click and drag on the blue axis, no matter how sloppy my mouse is, it's not going to move in Z or in foreground background space. Okay, so you can see as I drag this around, it's staying in line. Okay, if I grab it by the red axis, it only slides in the direction of the axis or the Y. And what I'm doing is I'm selecting the blue, restricting it according to the blue axis or the Z axis, allowing me to move it in Y or X at the same time. If I change my perspective and I want to restrict its Y movement, so it's up-down movement, and only move it left-right, foreground or background, I could grab it according to the green rectangle here and just kind of drag this around. It looks like I missed it because I could see it was not floating in. There we go. Okay. So I'll grab it, just kind of move it over here. I'm going to go to my rotation, and I'm going to rotate it along the Y axis. I'll just type in 180 degrees and get this pointing in another direction. And I'll just kind of continue to move this around. So maybe I'll just kind of move this up here. I'll grab my ball or my sphere, and I'll just move this right about there. And I'll hit the play button and see what happens. Okay, so I got just some real simple different results based on what I just created. Knocking over the domino, kind of messing with these platforms. In the next presentation, I'm going to go over something that is optional, bringing in 3D objects from something like Cinema 4D and using them inside your game engine. I'll also include this in the tips and tricks because this is not required for this project, but I do want to get this information out there if you want to experiment with it. So the next video in this presentation will be optional, but then we're going to go back and kind of do a wrap-up with this project and talk about some of the other requirements before we move forward. So have fun playing with physic materials and start to experiment with different kinds of solutions, little chaos that you can build inside this level just to create kind of a passive environment. And we'll push forward in the next presentation.